Going. So, hi everyone. Thanks for coming and joining us for our sixth public episode of the Extra Pro Life Show, where we discuss all things related to abortion in Canada and beyond. On the show, we aim to give you a look into organizations who are tackling the crisis of abortion, help you learn from them, critically think about what it means to be pro-life in Canada today, as well as to showcase my bubble quizzing ribbons. That's kind of what the show is about. So we are a pro-life organization. We want every person in Canada to reject abortion, and so hopefully the show will inspire you and equip you to do just that. Throughout the show, you will have the opportunity to submit questions on the Q&A tab feature at the bottom of your screen. So write out those questions. We will start taking public questions about halfway through the show. Give us some good ones to ask, and also just be as clear as you can so that we don't have to paraphrase or to try to interpret your meaning if it's not clear. My name is Ben Matichuk, and it is my pleasure to represent the National Campus Life Network as the regional coordinator of Alberta and today's host. We are proud and excited about what we get to do nationally, which is work with 21 clubs and over 200 youth across Canada to fight the greatest human rights and justice of our time. You can find out more about what we do at ncln.ca. Now, today, we're going to discuss two things that are supposedly linked to the degradation of our culture. Obviously, only the simple-minded would think that there are issues with the killing of a literal infant, and only the simple-minded would have a problem with the hypersexualization of women to the point that they are viewed as nothing more than sexual objects in our culture, which causes increased rates of sexual assault and more marriages to fail. So how someone could have a problem with that will simply never make sense to me. Anyway, our guest not only thinks that these things are bad, but goes as far as to say that there's actually a link between them, and that is Jonathon Van Maren. Jonathon is a public speaker, writer, and pro-life activist. His commentary has been translated into more than 8 languages and published widely online as well as in print newspapers such as the Jewish Independent, the National Post, the Hamilton Spectator, and others. He has received an award for combating anti-Semitism in print from the Jewish organization B'nai B'rith. His commentary has been featured on CTV Primetime, Global News, EWTN, and the CBC, as well as dozens of radio stations and news outlets in Canada and the United States. He speaks on a wide variety of cultural topics across North America at universities, high schools, churches, and other functions, with a specialty in pro-life strategy, among other topics. Jonathon holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in history from Simon Fraser University and is the communications director for the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform. Jonathon's first book, The Culture War, was released in 2016. And of course, Jonathon and I are well acquainted, mostly because he once accused me on Facebook of being strategic in the placement of my ribbons. This tension I've decided to put aside for the exact duration of this webinar. Jonathon, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ben.
So we're gonna get right into it, talking about, of course, the link between abortion and pornography, which most people would not guess are linked in any way. Both of these industries do exploit women. Is that the main thing that ties them together?
I would say it's one of the key things. I would say that's one of the commonalities more than one of the direct links. What we have with abortion and with pornography is that they commodify women, and they essentially see women as sex objects. As we know from all sorts of different investigations, most primarily by live action, but also criminal statistics. Abortion is a favorite tool of rapists, sexual abusers, sex traffickers, in order to rid themselves of a child and continue on in abusing women. There's many, most of which are too horrifying to get into, of especially sex traffickers availing themselves of abortion in order to force women to continue sex trafficking. The link between porn and sex trafficking is also quite literal, because often there's a massive overlap. In fact, with the debate of live stream pornography, which has exploded in the last 4 or 5 years, a lot of times it's the women who have been sex trafficked are also having videos of their so.
And sorry, Jonathon, I just have to cut you off. Is there a mic that you have with you? We're getting some audio issues on our end.
No.
Okay.
Is it my audio or is it the visual?
It's it could be both. We might just have to get you to lean closer to your computer. So
how's this? Am I clear now? That's a real unfortunate close-up, but
it seems okay. It'll come back, then it'll cut out. But let's give it a try. So sorry, you left off with sort of finishing up the question about commodifying women.
Yeah. And one of the commonalities, I'll just mention how I first started researching the link in the first place. And that was because any of you who have done pro-life activism will recognize that getting called names is very, very common. Especially, I find that females end up at the receiving end of this. It's happened increasingly over the last 3 or 4 years. And one of the things I noticed was the sexualized language that was being used. So, for example, Toronto, Ruth can tell you a story about this as well. All and that's not true even 10 years ago in terms of street activism. The language wasn't nearly as sexualized. It was always profane. It was true. But I was wondering where the mainstreaming of this sort of language came from. And that's when I started researching what was informing our culture in the background. When Ruth's saying sorry, is that because I'm cutting out, or?
A little bit. I don't really know of another solution, but to just keep going and hope it works itself out.
Okay, weird. Okay. One of the reasons I started into it as a to look at what is one of the key cultural influences that inform how we behave in public and how we behave in general. And that's when I started taking a look at the extent to which pornography was informing the background of most young people today. And so one of the primary things to take a look at, and our Catholic friends will recognize this, is the fact that one of the things that we see in abortion culture is the fact that procreation and sex have been sort of like separated from one another, that our culture no longer sees the connection between sex and procreation. I remember one debate at the University of Calgary, actually, when one guy said, well, what if I want to have recreational sex? And I had to point out to him that he didn't have recreational organs, he had reproductive organs. But that's one of the things pornography has hugely contributed to, which is the fact that millions upon millions of people now primarily inform themselves about sex through pornography. So just to give you an idea of how pervasive this is, about 80% of men and young men now look at pornography regularly. And now the number of women who view pornography regularly is over 50%. And that roughly adds up to, according to Pornhub statistics, the number of hours of pornography that were viewed in 2016. If you add the hours into days, the days into months, and the months into years, what you end up with is 524,641 years of pornography being viewed. So this is the primary sex education for most people in our culture. And one of the things we have found, and some of you campus activists may have found the same thing, but one of the things we found in our conversations with CCBR is that most people no longer see the connection between sex and pregnancy. And pornography has hugely enforced this idea. I actually interviewed several porn stars for my book, The Culture War, just to ask them about their experience in the porn industry, what it was like. And that was actually one of the things that they brought up, was that pornography separated sex from pregnancy.
Now, going into, of course, the link, something that you've also claimed is that there's a, and you're not the only one, but that there's a link between abortion and human trafficking. So, I mean, generally, are the two more closely related than the average person would think?
Well, as I said earlier, and there's an interesting Canadian connection here, because there's a book called The Natashas by Victor Malarick, who's one of the top investigative journalists in Canada. And he talks openly about how pimps and sex traffickers use abortion to keep the girls and the women that they have kidnapped and are forcing into sex slavery on the street. And so abortion is a necessary tool for sex traffickers and human traffickers to keep their business going. Because if you don't have abortion, the rate of pregnancy, as you can imagine, among a population of women and girls who are being forced to service up to dozens of clients per day, is astronomically high. if the abortion industry wasn't available to them to get rid of those children, it simply would be impossible for them to run any sex trafficking business with any form of longevity. There would be a constant cycle going on. And so abortion is a tool that is necessary for human traffickers to maintain their business. And it's necessary for them to keep girls and women in sex slavery to begin with. I don't actually, unless you have a really strong stomach, I don't necessarily advise reading Victor Malarich's book of the Natashas. It is brilliant, but it is truly grotesque. I've said that one of the reasons I wrote The Culture War was so that all of the important information could be strained out of these horrifying sources and be put sort of in one place. But any very simple amount of research will reveal that the abortion industry is the backup plan for human traffickers and pimps.
Now, this question is a tough one to ask because it kind of depends on certain philosophies, I guess. But look, let's say you have somebody, they're in the pro-life movement, they're doing activism, they want to see abortion end, and so obviously those are all very, very good things. But at the same time, they struggle with and consume porn. So to those men, what is your message?
Well, I have a couple of messages. The first one is I know a huge number of men who actually successfully quit porn because of the relationships they built and the fulfillment they found working in the pro-life movement to begin with. So there is, in all likelihood, people that are part of campus clubs right now who struggle with porn. I would bet my library on it, no problem. Like, pornography is extraordinarily pervasive. This generation has grown up with constant 24/7 access to an extraordinarily addictive and toxic substance. And so one of the things that I always like to point out is that I've actually had guys who were hooked on porn ask me that question directly. They'd say, I have struggled for 2 years, 5 years. I had one guy who told me he had struggled with porn for 10 years and he felt horribly guilty. He said, I know now that by viewing pornography, I am contributing to the commodification of women. I am contributing to their degradation and their victimization. So why would the pro-life movement want somebody like me? And my answer to that is very, very simple. The pro-life movement desperately needs young men who have figured out how to conquer the demons in their own life, to defeat vice and to build virtue. Guys who know how to fight the demons in their own lives, I think, are uniquely equipped to fight them in the culture. The same reason, way, for example, that post-abortive women have an extraordinary role in the pro-life movement, because somebody could say the same thing, right? I've had an abortion. What do I have to bring? Well, to redeem that experience by using that experience, sharing it with people to save lives. And so I tell young men that we absolutely need people who have struggled with porn. And if you are struggling with porn right now, I'll give you one encouraging note is I have talked to, it is not an exaggeration to say, dozens of men in the pro-life movement who have struggled with pornography. Every single one of them successfully got free. It took longer for some than for others, right? Some people did it cold turkey and never looked at porn again. Others would have relapses, struggle with it, have to go talk to their friends and their accountability partners about it. But freedom absolutely is possible. And the experience of fighting pornography in your own life, I believe, equips you to fight on the front lines of the pro-life movement. The pro-life movement's problem is not too many men, as the media would have you believe. The pro-life movement's problem is far too few men. I don't know what your experience at NCLN is like, but I've been to NCLN conferences that felt like the estrogen sea. There was like one lonely dude in the corner, and all the other leaders were female. We've had the same thing at CCVR, where we've had internships that were 90% female because the men often were AWOL. And one of the things that I discovered, so I remember calling a couple of guys who had expressed interest in joining the internship, in getting involved in the pro-life movement, and saying, hey, like, why didn't you apply? Why did you back off? And in several instances, they admitted that the private shame of struggling with pornography was preventing them from taking that step into the public square, because they said, look, if I was fighting for babies in the public square, fighting for women in the public square, while nursing this vice in my private life, I would feel like too much of a hypocrite. And so I suggested to them that maybe the right response to that was to instead use the desire to do something to save babies and to protect women in the public square as an extra motivation to purging this out of their lives. And there's no better time to start working on saving babies than now. And I'll say, like a guy in the pro-life movement is the accountability partner I have for my Covenant Eyes on my computer. The pro-life movement is filled with broken people who are reaching out to other broken people and sharing our experiences with one another. As long as we're fighting and not just whining for catharsis, the pro-life movement can be an extraordinary opportunity to connect with people who are willing to speak with broken people. So to the pro-life guys who say, well, I'm struggling with porn and I don't want to get involved because I feel like a hypocrite, there's a better answer than not being involved. And again, I want to reiterate, the problem with the pro-life movement is there are not enough guys, and guys have a role, a protector role to play in the pro-life movement, because guys and girls come at this issue from a different angle often. And if you have one, we lose out on the arguments and experiences of one gender, and same thing with the other one. You need both guys and girls in the movement in order for this movement to reach the maximum amount of people.
And yeah, so I really, what I hear you saying, and I just want to relay that message strongly because I do agree. Number one, it's not about what you did; it's about what you do. Like, it doesn't, you were addicted to porn. Who cares? Just go do good work. And also, and I definitely, Covenant Eyes, accountable to you is what I use. Every device I have is protected. It's more comfortable that way. And
CCBR actually has a company plan that we purchased so that it can be on every device.
Yeah, that's great, and that's kind of the culture that we live in, and that's fine. That's fine. I think I speak for a lot of men who say, if that's the price that it takes to not indulge in this, I'm willing to pay it, 100 times over. So,
100%.
So I mean, with that, of course, as we look at the effect that porn does have, if porn were to be abolished in North American society, would that presumably affect abortion numbers or our culture's attitude toward abortion?
So I think it will, for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is when you consider the rates, once again, I just want to re-emphasize the extent to which porn is everywhere. And I find that those of us who grew up in Christian homes, where maybe it wasn't talked about very openly, because this problem has only become as widespread, right? Like in 1953, Playboy launched. And if you wanted porn, right, you'd have to wear like a trench coat and a ski mask and creep into some corner store 30 minutes away from your house, hoping nobody would see you do it. Now you just need a Wi-Fi connection and a smartphone. And so again, like, we're talking about over 80% of young men, and that's considered a low estimate. That estimate is 6 years old. It's the last good numbers that we have. In my experience, I think the number is probably substantially higher. And one of the things that pornography does is it rewires your brain. It fundamentally changes the way you think. There's a fascinating website put up by Dr. Gary Wilson called "This Is Your Brain on Porn" that explains how it rewires your brain. And there's actually been studies done at Harvard that show what part of a male brain lights up when they're viewing pornography. And it's the part of the brain that indicates tool use rather than a human being. And that's creating a mindset among men that is entrenching the selfishness brought about by the sexual revolution. And I'll just pose a question to help frame this point. Is, if you have a generation of young men who are dehumanizing the women that they can see, how much easier is it for them to dehumanize the child that they can't see? Right? I speak in schools right across the Greater Toronto area. Rates of porn addiction are sky high, even in Christian schools. And they will admit that they have a hard time talking to a girl like she's a girl. I got an email from a kid in grade 12 last year, right before graduation. He said, I really want to take a girl to grad, but my head is so clogged with porn, I can't even look at a female and see a person, just all these images churning through my head. And so, like, if you think that the average age of a young man looking at porn in Canada, it starts at age 10 is the average age. That age keeps on going younger. Well over 80%, more than 500,000 years worth of porn viewed on Pornhub, which is based out of Montreal, incidentally. Since 2020, like just in the year 2016 alone. Add on to that the fact that that's roughly 12 porn videos for every man, woman, and child on planet Earth. Now imagine what happens when a whole generation of people are trained to see their sexual partners as objects for their sexual pleasure rather than people to form a partnership. Like, it was already, with the sexual revolution, it was already difficult to really get the point across in the culture that, like, sex makes babies. We're the most sexually experienced culture in the history of the world, and we've forgotten the basic stuff. I had a guy who came up to me at the University of Calgary and said, I got my girlfriend pregnant, and I don't even know how that happened. And I was like, I wasn't even there, and I know how it happened, right? How did the public school fail you so badly? Sex makes babies. But a constant diet of pornography and sex education that circles around personal pleasure rather than a union of two people has basically ensured that children are so far out of our realm of thinking that when their sexual partner is being dehumanized, pregnancy doesn't even enter one's mind. And when you're, again, dehumanizing and objectifying your sexual partner, dehumanizing the baby is that much easier. That's actually an observation we at CCBR came to talking to young men in front of high schools. One year we hit every public high school in Toronto with our choice chain displays. And I did the research to back it up. Most of the connection between porn and abortion, we first observed in our conversations with young people on campus and in high schools. And then I went looking for the research that existed behind that. So I absolutely believe that if we could solve the porn problem, if we could drain the swamp, that's kind of a poison phrase at this stage. But if we could drain the swamp, then we would do a lot better. I think the pro-life movement's job would be made a lot easier.
I want to focus on what you specifically have written extensively on, and I think the categories there would be, porn, abortion, euthanasia, human trafficking. At first glance, you look at something that might not be, like, you look at euthanasia and you look at human trafficking and you say those have no connection at all. But is that actually the case?
Well, see, like, the link is sort of circular, right? Because euthanasia generally comes into a culture right around 25 to 30 years after abortion is legalized. And that's simply because if you're not consistently reproducing your birth rate, then the money being fed into the healthcare system starts to dry up because you don't have new taxpayers, you don't have a workforce. Despite what you might read in the media, immigrants aren't replacing the workforce because a bulk of the immigrants are family members coming over and things like that. So we're not actually replacing our workforce. We start running out of money. And then, as I said on the Monday webinar, you have the state broadcaster, the CBC, actually explaining how much money euthanasia is going to save us. There's simply not enough people being born to pay the healthcare costs for those who are growing old. And it's no accident that euthanasia comes in generally 25 to 30 years after abortion is legalized. And then one of the things that's interesting about abortion and human trafficking, besides the links already mentioned, is that you often do, for example, have a gender skew. So human trafficking in Asia is driven primarily by the fact that there are far more men than women. And so you have all of these sexually frustrated males who are now seeking out prostitutes. That explodes the demand for the sex trade. And then you've got criminals and human traffickers who are willing to fill that need by preying on people, by selling people into sexual slavery. And so these things, once you leave, I've said before, I can trace every every ill in our society. It's always 3 degrees away from abortion. Because once you start destroying the upcoming generation, once you start killing children in the womb, the ripple effects destroy your society. The ripple effects are outwards. So sex trafficking and euthanasia, for example, not directly linked, but they're linked in that they're both directly linked back to abortion, and they all feed off of each other. Of course, the major commonality is just our view of human nature, right? This materialist view that human beings are bodies without souls, and therefore it's permissible to do more or less anything to a human being, right? It's interesting, the term eugenics, which is often used, especially in the context of how many babies are aborted for, a cleft palate, for Down syndrome, or things like that. Eugenics is Greek for good birth, and euthanasia is Greek for good death. And so what we have is we're now burning the candle at both ends.
Now, well, and it's clear to see how, and not clear, I guess it's more implicit, but as you explain it, it's just kind of, you don't have a culture that treats sex as something that is unimportant, that is not ultimately going to become a culture of death. And of course, we've heard it said that, we were told in the sexual revolution that it wouldn't affect what we know about right and wrong. but
Mhm.
we no longer know the difference between male and female. So knowing
Yeah.
those things, and of course, Jonathan, believing as you do that porn and abortion are linked, how do you hope to go about obtaining the abolition of both in Canada?
So the porn question is really, really difficult, because sometimes I wonder on that specific question if we've been just in time to be too late. And by that I mean, like, I think that things are going to have to crash, because unfortunately, we're only starting to recognize, because our hypersexualized culture dictates the only sin left is calling something wrong to begin with, right? And so to condemn pornography was to condemn a form of sexual expression, which of course is a thing you can't do anymore. The good news on the pornography front, and the reason I qualify the good news, is because this recognition has come about at enormous cost to millions of young people, especially the people who have grown up with pornography just being there, right? The generation that has grown up addicted to porn didn't ask to be brought up in this generation. And adults, by and large, didn't bring it up, didn't even see the problem coming. And so now we're seeing the problem get recognized, and it'll be interesting to see what the next steps are. So we're at almost 10 states in the United States that have declared porn a public health crisis, because it rewires the brain, and because the type of pornography that's now mainstreaming is mainstreaming sexual assault against women. I can give you all the data for that if you're interested. You have the Republican Party of the United States that has declared pornography a public health crisis as well. Despite the fact that the current president, starred in Playboy films at one point, but that's neither here nor there, I suppose. The United Kingdom has now been working for 5 years to try and get meaningful age verification on all porn sites, which basically puts an extra step between minors trying to access porn sites. You have to have a credit card, which means you have to be over 18. They've done a lot of messing around with that. It was supposed to be implemented 12 months ago. I was really enthusiastic about the system. I thought it would do a lot of good work keeping kids off of porn sites. But now they found some problems with the filters, and then they're now working on restructuring that system, and then they're going to try again. Australia is considering similar measures. The Scandinavian countries are also considering getting rid of porn. An interesting case too is Nepal has just banned porn entirely, once they realized that it had resulted in a more than 100% spike in the rape rate over 1 decade. So they just went out and actually banned porn entirely, because they said this material is feeding everything that's destroying our society and tearing at our cultural fabric. I've said before, porn isn't the worst problem, but porn makes every other problem worse, right? So I don't think porn is worse than abortion, but porn makes abortion worse. Porn isn't worse than physical rape, but it makes it worse. It inspires more people to perpetrate those acts. And so here in Canada, I was really enthusiastic by the fact that Arnold Viersen, when he was elected, he's the MP from Peace River Westlock. He put forward a motion to have the Standing Committee on Health research the connection between porn and sexual violence. And it was actually, the motion was passed unanimously. The NDP, the Liberals, and the Conservatives all voted for the motion, which is just extraordinary on an issue as controversial as this. And Justin Trudeau had mentioned he thought there might be a connection between sexual violence and pornography. So, like, even a broken clock can be right twice a day. The interesting thing, however, with what happened there is, so all of these experts were brought forward to testify to the Standing Committee on Health. You had women from hardcore feminist, pro-abortion, rape crisis centers, and battered women's shelters testifying before the Standing Committee on Health and saying pornography is fueling sexual assault. Women are coming into our centers, and their assaults were inspired by pornography or made worse by pornography. And at the last minute, the Liberal government actually asked that any testimony not by a medical professional had to be struck, including those from the rape crisis centers. And I don't know, we still haven't figured out exactly what that last minute move to strike most of the evidence that was not coming from social conservatives like me. It was coming from people who believe what Trudeau believes on abortion and things like that. It was very strange to see that happen. I suspect that MindGeek, which is the company that owns Pornhub, the biggest porn company in the world, and it's based out of Montreal, that their lobbyists placed a few last-minute calls, because to establish that link would automatically mean that the next steps looked at would be age verification, which was also recommended in the Standing Committee on Health report. And that would, of course, prevent a lot of young customers from getting onto Pornhub's porn site. So I'm still trying to figure out exactly what happened there. There's freedom of access to information requests and things like that pending. But in Canada, we had taken a giant step forward, and it was a bipartisan step forward. So I'm not sure what the next steps are in Canada besides constant education. So I do a lot of that, speaking in schools. I think there's a lot of awareness being raised recently. But I'm talking to some MPs to see what can be done next, because if the UK can pass meaningful age verification, I think that's the best first step. That's definitely the best first step, is just to get meaningful age verification. Keep the kids off the porn sites is step one. And there's things that we can do that should not be controversial.
Yeah, no, that's all great information, and I of course agree with it. I want to point out a few things we had on the chat here. We had Anna do a plug for Fight the New Drug, which I'm just gonna echo that. Definitely go follow them. We also and of course, look, so much of this comes down to the home, and I think a big part of it. I hope we're not too late, because even a decade, maybe a decade and a half ago, we had all these parents who, porn came onto the internet and they just weren't ready for it. Obviously, that's not when
100%.
porn came onto the internet, but they didn't know how to parent for that. And so now that's changing, thankfully, that we do have parents who are more aware of that. Now we're going to get into public questions, and this first one comes from Josh, and I've got a couple from Josh. They're very pointed, and I actually want to really thank Josh for these questions, because they're very pointed questions that I think are going to prompt a lot of good information. So he says in the first one, some people think porn consumption reduces rape because it provides an outlet. Those reductions in rape mean less abortion. So how would you respond to people who argue that porn is actually reducing abortion?
I am so grateful for that question. I wrote a 2,000-word essay rebutting that point when Ross Douthat made the same point in the New York Times. So one of the ways that they make the claim that pornography has reduced the rape rate is by changing the definition of sexual assault to begin with. And so what has happened is that what pornography has done is it's mainstreamed sexual violence in the romantic context. So things that used to be considered sexual violence are no longer considered sexual violence. I'll give you one example. Ben, you probably do you remember Jian Ghomeshi? I'm trying to figure out how dated people like me and the even more elderly Ruth are.
I do remember Ghomeshi, yeah.
Yeah, so you remember that he lost his job as a major CBC host when he found out that he was living a 50 Shades of Grey lifestyle, his exact words, which basically meant that he got his jollies hitting girls and perpetrating all sorts of sexual violence. And the thing that struck me that really was, I thought, a watershed moment that indicated that pornography had so successfully shifted our definition of sexual violence that we didn't even notice it anymore. The front page of the Toronto Star ran the story on Jian Gomeshi's ouster, and the phrase that stuck out to me was they said he had been accused of unwanted sexual violence. And I was like, what is the word unwanted doing there? Right? The inherent assumption of that statement, and now the inherent assumption that pornography has created in our culture, is that some sexual violence can be wanted. Now, technically speaking, to do all of the violent sexual practices now promoted by porn, it's technically still is illegal. You cannot consent to be assaulted, right? I can invite a guy to a fist fight and we can beat the tar out of each other. But if I knock him out, the cops will still arrest me for assault, because even if he agreed to the fight, he cannot consent to being assaulted. There was an article in the Globe and Mail after Jian Gomeshi's not conviction, actually after his acquittal, where he basically got off scot-free, because although he had been choking women, for example, to the point of unconsciousness, the judge said that because it was that it could not be proven that they weren't consensual, that therefore he could go off scot-free. And a lawyer wrote an article in the Globe and Mail, which is not a conservative paper, saying women can't consent to be choked into unconsciousness. Because you're not allowed to consent any more than you, Ben, can consent to, being in a barroom brawl where you get your face smashed in. That's just not something that the law permits. I'll throw in another statistic that proves my point. So what pornography has done is it's mainstreamed the idea that sexual violence is now acceptable in the romantic context. The Atlantic magazine, which is a very liberal publication, released an analysis 4 months ago stating that now a quarter of American women, or just shy, 24%, of adult American women now report feeling fear during intimacy because of porn-inspired choking that takes place during intimacy. So we used to say that, okay, a guy who wants to choke a girl into unconsciousness, one of the quotes in this article, and I'm sorry if I'm getting too graphic, but I really appreciate that question, and I want to drive it home. One of the guys said to the girl when she came to, sorry, when I saw that it was hurting you, I just got too turned on. He, by the way, everything he did is now considered legal by the courts because pornography has created this idea, driven especially by 50 Shades of Grey and then the male equivalents of BDSM pornography, that is now mainstream among young people. Mainstream among young people, by the way, the vast majority of Canadians under age 18 are watching pornography that primarily features violence against women. 88% of mainstream content is violent. And so they now believe that this is the sort of thing that's mainstream. And so what the porn defenders are doing is saying that the rate of people who are jumping out in alleys and raping somebody has gone down. That's true. But the rate of sexual violence has skyrocketed because it's also been mainstreamed as something acceptable. I could give you 36 examples of people inside the church, inside the broader Christian umbrella church, so Catholic, Protestant, who say that this is the sort of thing that like their partners are trying to push onto them because they saw it in porn and thought that it was normal. They saw 50 Shades of Grey or read the book and thought, well, okay, well, I guess hitting girls is okay in the sexual context. So yes, the legal definition of rape, that is lower now and has been since the early 1990s. That rate has been dropping. The rate of sexual violence from choking, restraining, hitting, down to things in pornography that are considered illegal under the Geneva Convention, that has been skyrocketing at a rate that we have never before seen in the history of Western civilization. So convictable sexual violent offenses going down, sexual violence skyrocketing. And I can tell you heartbreaking stories from girls as young as 13 at Christian schools asking me why their boyfriends want to try this stuff out.
And of course, it's such a vicious cycle. If it's all based on consent, well, we already have a culture that speaks against and goes against the exact, the home that I was brought up in with two loving parents, a mom and a dad. Our culture speaks against that. You have people who are brought up so broken because of that, and then it's all based on consent. So you have broken people consenting to things that they should not be consenting to.
Exactly.
So I appreciate all that. Now, this second question from Josh, I'm going to hold off on and try to get to questions from others first, and then go back to that one. So this next one comes from Josephine. She's I believe from some kind of backbencher province like Saskatchewan or something like that. Anyway, her question is, how can we keep kids and teens away from porn when restrictions can lead them to get it from friends and hide it, but allowance gives it straight to them?
So every approach has to be open. So restrictions are important, filters are important, accountability is important for raising kids. We like my daughter's turning 3 in August. We already have books like Good Pictures, Bad Pictures to start introducing the topic to her in an age appropriate way, so that if she encounters it, she knows that to come talk to us right away. But yeah, these days, you can try to prevent access as much as you can, and you should, but open conversations are the only way that we're going to beat this thing. Because at the end of the day, in a totally digital world, kids are going to get porn if they want it. And so they actually have to have it explained. Why is it so poisonous, right? Like I remember in school, we used to have presentations on drinking and driving, where we had a guy whose face was like half melted come in and explain to us what had happened to him when he got caught in a drinking and driving accident. We had people who had been like horribly disfigured by crystal meth come in, talk about the same thing. We need to treat porn like a toxic substance, and we need to explain to people why it's so toxic and why it's so poisonous. So open communication is the only way that we're going to beat this thing.
Yeah, very true. And that's exactly why things like, sheltering, parents sheltering their kids, right? They so often those kids get into the real world, they see things that they were never exposed to. They think that they're good, and that's how so many,
and then they have no defenses
away from the face. Yeah, they need to be exposed to these things. So this next one comes from Rose. It's a similar question to Josephine's, but how would you educate kids to avoid pornography? But it's marrying the two, right? How do we address pornography and educate them without exposing it to them in a way that they're now aware of it when they otherwise would not have been?
So the best peer-reviewed research on this, and most of it's for free, is Protect Young Minds. You can check them out. You can Google them. They're phenomenal. I've done multiple interviews with the founder of that organization, and their full-time job, they have a full-time team, including professionals who are basically just researching the best ways to have these conversations with kids. They're the ones who produced the book, Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, and they've done just an absolutely phenomenal job. So they're a resource I would highly recommend.
Circling back to Josh's second question, you might be repeating yourself, but that's okay. Repetition is not necessarily a bad thing. If porn is causing widespread erectile dysfunction, wouldn't that be sort of an obviously unideal way in which porn lowers abortion rates?
Well, it really depends on what you call ideal, right? There are plenty of ways to solve certain issues that are horrifying. We could sterilize everybody, and that would solve the abortion rate too. But it's not a moral way to address the issue, right? There are plenty of horrific and unethical ways to reduce the abortion rate. And when it comes to pornography, one of the things I think it's important to recognize, and it's really interesting that question got brought up, because there was an article in The Guardian recently that talked about it was a story by a very left-wing liberal feminist pro-abortion writer who basically discussed how her marriage fell apart because her husband couldn't get an erection without pornography, and so he didn't stop having sex. He just played porn in the bedroom. And that's what a lot of these guys are doing. Like, again, sorry to be so explicit, but the guys that have erectile dysfunction as a result of pornography are typically introducing pornography into the bedroom. They've got it playing on the TV, and so it's not stopping pregnancy. What it's doing is it's just turning a lot of these marriages into hell. It's turning these relationships into horrific predatory relationships. And what we end up having is women who are objectified. They're subjected to degrading material. Other naked people are being brought into the relationship on a screen, and we're not lowering the abortion rate. So if you just had widespread erectile dysfunction among men from the ages of 18 to 35, and they weren't having sex, then theoretically that would bring down the abortion rate, although I would still argue that that's not the way to do it. But that's actually not the case, because what they're doing is pornography is now what they need to get them where they need to go, kind of like Viagra.
This next one actually comes from Ruth, and I think it's a very important question because, again, if you are a guy, or I guess even a girl who is here, you struggle with pornography, but you want to do good work for the pro-life movement and other movements as well. Obviously, welcome here. We invite you to stay. But this question coming from Ruth: what is it that actually makes porn so addictive?
That's actually the easiest question to answer, for example. Right? Like, I smoked cigarettes for years. I still smoke cigars sometimes now. But like, as an example, you're not born a smoker, right? I remember like the first cigarette I had when I was like 17, you cough your lungs out, and then I was an idiot. And so you have another one, and like finally down the road, you get addicted. And it often takes you like a couple of years to get addicted. Why? Because nobody's born a smoker. The same thing is true with cocaine, right? You're not born to snort something up your nose. Crystal meth, you're not born to inject something into your arm, right? Hard liquor, somebody who has an alcohol dependency, by and large, right? People don't like the first drink of alcohol they've taken. The reason pornography is so much more addictive and so much more toxic is because everybody is born as a sexual being. And so at bottom, people can hear, oh, that's mainstream and porn, that's disgusting. I promise you that there is a kind of pornography you would be attracted to. That's why it's so important for all of us to protect ourselves. The biblical example I use, because I assume most people on this call are probably of a religious background of some sort, is I always say anybody who says that they won't struggle with sexual temptation is saying they're stronger than Samson, the strongest man who ever lived, wiser than Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, and closer to God than David, the man after God's own heart. And I'm sure with all of your ribbons there, you could probably give us a few more relevant examples. The point being is that all of us are sexual beings. We do have asexuality, and there's a right way to express that and a wrong way to express that. A right context in which you can morally express it, and then context in which it's immoral to express it. So you're not born a smoker, you're not born a crackhead, and you're not born an alcoholic, but you are born and you will have sexual desires. You are a sexual being, and therefore, smoking smoking and booze and drugs. There's a limited number of people who will be susceptible to those specific addictions. Everybody is at risk, male or female, of getting addicted to pornography, and that's why pornography has conquered our culture in such a short amount of time.
Well, since you called on me, I will touch on that a little bit, especially, I maybe not everybody here is religious. That's fine. You're welcome here. I certainly am and always will be. And this is sort of a teaching that I gave earlier this year, which basically says if we look at 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10, which lists off all these different sins, sexual immorality, men who have sex with men, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, slanderers, swindlers, if we look at passages like that, and we're so eager to sort of pat ourselves on the back, so that because it feels good. I'm not condemning
Yeah.
anybody for that, but if you look at those verses and you're just going over these different sins and saying, "Oh, I don't struggle with that. I don't struggle with that. I don't struggle with that," so you can kind of reach over. Well, the enemy loves that. He's looking at you being just like, "Oh, they don't know." If you look at a sin and you don't struggle and you do struggle with it, but you think that you don't, that's exactly where the enemy wants you. And so there's nothing wrong with pinpointing, okay, what is it that actually makes this so difficult, because that's what's going to help you get out of it. And I've even spoken to friends who have said, I've started to predict what brings on the urge. I've started to look at the situations that cause me to be tempted, and so then that way, because I'm able to predict it, I can see it coming, and therefore I'm able to prepare myself and obviously better deal with the temptation. Now,
Because
this
otherwise get into the shame cycle, right? Because like people have to realize too that pornography gives you a dopamine rush. So like you're susceptible because it's sexual. But people will like look at pornography and then the rush fades and they feel awful because they know what they did was wrong, but also the crash just feels bad. And then they want to do what makes them feel good. So they go back to porn and it's a cycle, right? It's the truth, most addictions, right? It's the same thing with alcohol, where somebody will get loaded because they feel terrible. And then the hangover afterwards makes them feel so terrible that they go to the thing that makes them feel good, which is alcohol. Pornography, porn addiction functions very similarly to other addictions in that way.
Indeed, and shame cycle. Anybody who has followed the Conquer series, which I highly recommend, has heard that term before. Now, this next question was submitted anonymously. Any suggestions for how to condemn porn without condemning the users of porn?
Well, it's very easy, right? Like at this point, pretty much the entire culture has a porn problem. All right. I always say, look, every single one of you, if you're not addicted to porn yourself, I promise you that you know somebody who is. If you don't know who, you just haven't found out yet, right? But this is a problem we all have to collectively fight. So is porn a moral wrong? Sure, but it's all about hate the sin and love the sinner, right? And we are all sinners. Like that verse you just lifted off, right? If porn's not your thing, you've got something else. And so it's like condemning pornography. I hate pornography because I've seen it destroy so many people. I've seen it destroy like my friends' marriages. I've seen girls come out of relationships like horribly affected by it, and I've seen it destroy really great guys. Like guys that who had everything going for them. They had a heart of gold. They were great. And I've had a 55-year-old dad sitting next to me in a truck on the way back from a pro-life presentation. Beautiful family, just heartbreaking sobs because pornography has just utterly destroyed his life, even though he loves his family. So condemning people for looking at porn is just a no-go, because you need to explain what porn's doing to you. Now, like proviso here, if I'm talking to one of my friends and I see you have to have a relationship with the person, right? Like if one of my friends was looking at porn and they were pretending to quit, but they weren't, yeah, at a certain point, I'd be like, your girlfriend should dump you and you're being a terrible person. But that you need a personal relationship to do that, right? I would never tell any of you that you're a terrible person, but I have friends that I would call out. And I hope you all have friends who tell you when you're being terrible as well, because that's what friends are there for.
Indeed, and it goes into another conversation too about if you're addicted, you need accountability, and if you're not addicted, then you should find somebody that you can help and be accountable to, because very very rarely is this battle won alone, because it's just you using your own brain, and when you're on porn, your brain is broken. That's just how it works in any addiction, as we know from things like the Conquer series as well. Now, this next question comes from Shayna, and depending on the length of your answer, we might have time for one more, but I'll just go ahead and ask it. If the root problem of all these issues is the wrong view of the nature of human beings, consisting of both body and soul, namely not viewing that they have a body and a soul, what could be the best way to educate the culture on the fact that humans are more than just a physical body?
That's ground up work, right? I always say the pro-life movement is not the church, although the pro-life movement emanates from the church. The pro-life movement is responding to an emergency. 300 babies are dying every day, and it's our job to get in between the clinics and the mothers. And then people will say it's not enough. I know it's not enough. Our culture is profoundly broken. Our culture, in my view, needs Christ. Our culture needs a better view of human nature. There are so many problems to deal with. But for me, the pro-life movement is the movement tasked with responding to the fact that babies are being killed. So I would say that is the task of the church. I always say the pro-life movement is just the tip of the spear, but there's still the rest of the spear that has to follow it. And so I will say that our culture needs a radical transformation on a whole bunch of different issues. The pro-life movement is bigger than it was 5 years ago, but it's still very small. With our limited resources, I see us as responding to an emergency, right? And we're emergency first responders trying to save babies. Once we pull the babies out of the burning house, the firefighters can show up and put out the fire. People can come back and rebuild the house. And all of those people are needed, but if we all tried to do everything, we would end up doing nothing. So I would just distinguish that is in my view, that is the task of the Christian church to be doing that. And some of them are doing a great job of that, and some of them are not doing so great a job of it. But that just needs to come in behind.
Yeah, and of course it goes into a whole bigger conversation about, I guess, what role even faith plays, even faith in Jesus Christ plays. And that's a conversation that we're having on Monday in our student webinar with secular pro-life Kelsey Hazard, and how you can be pro-life without being religious. But the fact of the matter is too, and I have no problem publicly saying this, the pro-life view is good, the anti-porn view is good. All these views that are conservative, the view of small government, free speech, all that stuff, those are all good, but none of them are salvific. None of them save you. Only Jesus Christ does that.
Well, one of the things I always say about the a lot of people always say, why are so many pro-lifers Christian? And my point to that is that if you think you have to be Christian in order to think that killing babies is wrong, then maybe you should reconsider your worldview, because I've got one that provides you everything you need to think that killing human beings is wrong. So when they try to accuse you of coming from your religious convictions, the response I just generally use is it's a pretty brutal indictment of the secular worldview if you say that your worldview doesn't give you the capacity to condemn baby killing.
Now, of course, I want to give you an opportunity to plug a little bit. You talked about your book, The Culture War. I want to say specifically for any guys who've heard this conversation, who are doing this work, but who still struggle with porn, I want to say specifically for them, where can they go to see more of your writings on this in a way that helps them fight the good fight in the best way?
I basically blog on all these subjects over at thebreadshed.ca. I've got a ton of interviews with everybody from Matt Pratt of Porn Effect, who talks about how to break porn addiction. I did an interview with Protect Young Minds. But for anybody listening to this who's struggling, please just go to covenanteyes.com. Covenanteyes.com. I do a lot of writing on the cultural impact, but if this is a personal thing for you, I've got Covenant Eyes. Ben has Covenant Eyes. If you don't have it, you should too. It's absolutely fantastic. It's just step by step how to. Covenant Eyes will give you all the information on how you need to get set up. You can phone their operators to help. You said I phoned them once because my computer was screwing up a bit with it. They had an operator on the line with me to tell me what was wrong in 30 seconds. And if you want first steps on that too, feel free to send one of us a message. We're all in this together, and if you just need somebody to help you take the first couple of steps, then just reach out to somebody. Because you're not alone. There are millions of people who are struggling. And my issue is with people who aren't struggling. They're just comfortable in their porn addiction. If you're struggling, that means you're fighting. That's good. If you're complacent in your porn addiction, that's bad. So stop sitting there and start struggling, because struggling is just part of being human and part of fighting the things that we need to rid ourselves of.
Indeed. Yeah. Thank you for saying all that. And thank you for coming on the show. And I just want to echo everything. And of course, look, if help is something that you need, obviously reach out to your guy friends, reach out to, we've all walked in this to some degree. Just either you've been in it or somebody who's been in it. We've all seen this to a certain degree. And so just be aware of that. I use accountable to you is what I use. My dad is my accountability partner, and my best friend is my accountability partner, and both actually administrate the two computers that I have. I'm not the administrator on either of my computers. If that's the price that it has to be, then I exhort you to pay, because it's worth it. It's worth it 100% across the board every time. So yeah, Jonathan, we really want to thank you for coming on the show. It's a great discussion to have, and I hope that those of you who are here that this has encouraged you in some way. we still got to keep going. We still got to save children. And it doesn't matter if your life isn't in order to be able to do that in the best way. Let's just make sure we do it. So yeah, Jonathan, really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
And that is everything that we have for you today. Just a quick announcement. The public webinars will now switch to a bi-weekly or sort of a semi-monthly frequency. So look for some updates from us about the formatting, sort of the different segments of the show that we're going to be having. We are going to be hunkering down for the long term with these. And so there will be some changes for the better in terms of time, in terms of the segments that we do have. Once again, thank you for joining us. Thank you to Jonathan. We hope to see you here again as we continue to host these webinars. And look, we just want you to remember, and this is important, well, maybe I feel silly saying this based on the point that Jonathan brought up earlier, but just because orange is the most awesome color, that doesn't mean you should vote NDP. So that's the outro that I wrote. I don't regret it. I stand by it completely. And we wish all of you